Hello, listeners. I apologize for being a little late with this episode. I didn't want to take any time off for the holidays until after finishing the 50th episode, so thank you for waiting since December 24th for this episode. MCP patrons got an away episode during this break, where I answered their questions. If you'd like access to away episodes like this one, you too can become a patron at the lowest tier, $1 an episode. I do 2 to 3 episodes a month, so it costs less than a cup of coffee a month to guarantee you won't miss out on a bit of the MCP. There may be more scheduling irregularities for the next few months, as I have several family functions to attend, and flying between the US and Australia is not a small or short undertaking. However, I'll do my best to keep putting out episodes during that time. I hate leaving you all hanging. Perhaps a short horror story is in order. Let me know what you'd like to hear. That's all I have for announcements, so let's begin the first MCP episode of 2019. This episode was suggested by a listener, Neve, on Twitter. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. Please be aware there will be much discussion of feces as a mechanism for the spread of disease in this episode. If you're squeamish, this might be a good one to skip. You've been warned. And now, on to the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. The name Typhoid Mary is used to describe a person, usually a female, who infects others with disease or some other negative effect. Typhoid Mary has been the subject of novels, plays, and television programs, one of which is called Fever, starring Elizabeth Moss, which is based on a book with the same title by Mary Beth Keane, due out sometime soon. A Marvel Comics villain is even named after Typhoid Mary. Most people know that there was a real woman behind this nickname, but not the true nature of her story. It's a story full of perspectives and many conflicting opinions, and it all starts with a contagious disease, sprung from a tiny bacteria. Contagious disease is a frightening concept. A contagious disease is an illness that spreads from person to person, sometimes very rapidly. When the disease spreads in large numbers, it's called an outbreak. An outbreak of contagious disease is even more frightening because when more and more people are affected, it's harder to control the pathogen, to stop its spread. Today, in most developed countries, outbreaks are uncommon, as we use vaccines and sanitation to control the spread of many contagious diseases. This was not the case in the time before the late 1800s and early 1900s. Disease was a major issue, especially in the growing urban centers of the world, where people were crowded together and public sanitation wasn't common. Before a sanitation infrastructure was implemented, the growing city of New York was, in a word, disgusting. Raw sewage could be found in rivers and wells thanks to overflowing outhouses. The streets were strewn with garbage, horse manure from carriages, and sometimes dead livestock. People were crammed into tenements or large buildings divided into many small apartments, often with entire families sharing one room. Thanks to the rise of germ theory at the end of the 1800s, the discovery that disease is caused by microscopic organisms and not bad air or the wrath of God, it had been shown that pathogens such as bacteria and viruses were present in sewage, garbage, and decaying animal corpses. The New York City Board of Health, which was established in 1805, and the New York State Department of Health, established in 1901, recognized that by cleaning up the city, they could control the germs and therefore prevent the spread of many of the contagious diseases that for a long time had plagued its citizens. They hired civil engineers and sanitation engineers to help install sanitation infrastructure and monitor outbreaks of disease in order to learn where their cleaning efforts should be concentrated. One of the most prominent diseases that the Board of Health was battling in the early 1900s was typhoid. Typhoid was one of the top 5 fatal infectious diseases in the United States at this time, along with influenza, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and diphtheria. In the year 1900, typhoid affected around 400,000 people, 35,000 of which died from the disease. The symptoms of typhoid start out flu-like, but as the disease progresses, the victim gets a high fever, around 104 Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, extreme fatigue and abdominal pain, chills, and red spots on the chest and abdomen. In severe cases, victims become delirious and begin to bleed from their intestines. They get weaker and weaker until they die in agonizing pain. Typhoid is caused by a bacteria, Salmonella typhi, which is passed from person to person via the fecal-oral route, meaning it's spread when one person ingests the feces of another person who's infected with the bacteria. This usually occurs through contaminated water or food. For example, when an outhouse where a sick person has defecated leaks into the river that someone else drinks from, or when flies land on raw sewage from an infected person and then land on fruit that someone else later eats. Typhoid can also spread when an infected person doesn't wash their hands after defecating and then prepares food for another person or shakes their hands. In the right conditions, the bacteria can stay active in water or soil for weeks after it's expelled from an infected person. Cooking food and boiling water does kill the bacteria, as does washing your hands for 20 seconds with soap and water after using the toilet. In early 1900s New York, however, many areas of the city still did not have modern plumbing, therefore washing hands wasn't as easy, and many toilets were just outhouses, so there was still a high risk of spreading typhoid, especially in the poorer areas of the city. Hence the Department of Health's hiring of civil and sanitation engineers to assist in identifying and fixing these issues. One of the engineers sometimes contracted by the city of New York was George Soper. Born in 1870, Soper had lost his father to disease, and therefore, as an adult, he joined the battle against germs by becoming a sanitary engineer. He was highly regarded as a germ detective and was often hired by both public institutions and private citizens to discover the origin of disease outbreaks and correct whatever situation was causing the contamination, be it sewage leaking into the water supply, tainted food, or a sick person spreading the disease. In 1906, Soper was called to investigate an outbreak of typhoid in an affluent area of Long Island called Oyster Bay. Charles Henry Warren and his family and staff were renting a house for the summer when 6 out of the 11 people in the household were struck with typhoid. Thankfully, no one died, but the owners of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, worried they wouldn't be able to rent the house again if the origin of the outbreak went undiscovered, and therefore hired Soper to investigate. He wasn't the first person they had hired, but the results of the previous investigation had been inconclusive. Soper began his investigation by reviewing the facts. Both the family and their staff had been affected. On August 27th, one of the Warrens' daughters had become ill. Next, 2 maids and Mrs. Warren, then another of the Warrens' daughters and the gardener had got sick. Soper made extensive inquiries with the dairy the family got their milk from, the grocery where they bought their food, and the water supply for the house. None of these showed any sign of contamination, so he ruled them out. He then turned to the staff and family members. No one had been sick, although Soper did note that the family had changed cooks just before they left for Oyster Bay. They had hired a woman named Mary Mallon to accompany them to their summer home. She came highly recommended by other affluent families, and they had thoroughly enjoyed her cooking, especially a dessert she made from ice cream and fresh peaches. Mallon had left their employment 3 weeks after the outbreak, and the family stated that she had not been sick, but had assisted in caring for the sick. Soper was intrigued. A cold dish with fresh fruit was an excellent way for typhoid to spread via unwashed hands, and everyone in the household would have eaten food prepared by the cook, which accounted for the widespread typhoid among both family and staff. But the cook herself had not been sick. Soper looked into Mary Mallon's employment history, visiting the people she had previously cooked for. All of them seemed pleased with her work, but when he asked if they had had any cases of typhoid while she was employed, 7 out of the 8 families that had employed her since the year 1900 had had cases of typhoid while she was employed. 22 cases in total, with 14 being servants and 8 being members of the families that employed her. The number of cases is often stated in the literature as 26, but Soper's documents only indicate 22. There's also no documentation to show how he got Mallon's employment history. Soper had recently heard about a type of disease transmission called an asymptomatic or healthy carrier, in which a person is infected with the disease, suffers little to no symptoms, but carries it with them for a long time afterwards. This meant that even though the person was healthy, they could still spread the disease. This method of disease transmission was discovered by Robert Koch, a German scientist who had found typhoid bacteria in healthy subjects who had previously suffered mild forms of the disease. Koch revealed this discovery to a group of scientists in Berlin in 1902. Since then, more and more healthy carriers had been identified all over Europe. The mechanism was not understood, but there was growing evidence that Koch was right. Healthy people could spread the disease. He also learned that the bacteria tended to settle in the gallbladder, an organ that sits just below the liver and stores the bile that's created by the liver. The bacteria could also settle into the bile ducts, the liver itself, and sometimes the kidneys. After his thorough research, Soper believed Mary Mallon was a healthy carrier of typhoid and probably had no idea that she was transmitting this deadly disease with her cooking. To prove this, however, he needed samples of Mallon's urine, feces, and blood to test for typhoid bacteria in a laboratory. If he indeed proved she was a healthy carrier, he would have discovered the very first healthy carrier of typhoid in North America. If he could prove his theory, it would be an exciting and dangerous discovery. This podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Our other sponsor is ThinkGeek, the premier retailer for the global geek community. Express your love of all that is geeky and nerdy with clever t-shirts and other unique apparel, home and office decor, electronics, collectibles, and more. ThinkGeek has great gifts whether you're into science or science fiction, and many of the items on their website you won't find anywhere else. Just follow our link, bit.ly/morbidgeek, to search their massive collection. That's bit.ly/morbidgeek to get your geek on. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed and being entered in a monthly raffle. When you become a patron, it helps us keep this show going. If more people become patrons, we may even be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no break in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you'll be directed to our Patreon page, where you can choose your rewards. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. In March 1907, Soper went to find Mallon and asked for the samples he needed to prove she was a healthy carrier of typhoid. He found Mallon at her place of employment, a large house on Park Avenue, a very affluent area of New York City. He went to the servants' entrance and was shown into the kitchen. There he met his suspected carrier, Mary Mallon. Mallon was 37 and stood at 5'6". She had blue eyes, blonde hair, and looked to be in excellent health. She spoke with an Irish accent, as she had immigrated to New York when she was a teenager from Cookstown, County Tyrone, in what is now Northern Ireland. Soper assumed Mallon had noticed that people around her kept getting typhoid. He asked her if she had never wondered if she might be the cause. He told her it wasn't her fault, but that it was very likely that she was spreading disease by not washing her hands after using the toilet. He then asked her for samples of her urine, feces, and blood. As you can imagine, Mallon was shocked and not a little offended. How would you react if a strange man came into your workplace, told you your hands were dirty with feces, that you were spreading disease even though you weren't sick, and then asked you to pee and poop in a jar? She promptly threw Soper out of the house. Soper, however, didn't give up. He wanted Mallon to understand the danger she was putting other people in. He asked around about Mallon and discovered that she had a male friend named Brehoff who lived in a tenement where Mallon sometimes stayed. Soper convinced Brehoff to alert him the next time Mallon was going to be there. He also convinced Brehoff not to let Mallon know he was coming. Once he had a date and time set, Soper brought a physician and friend named Dr. Bert Raymond Hubler with him to try once again to get samples from Mallon. As soon as Mallon saw him, however, she became enraged. She told Soper she was a clean and healthy woman. How could he accuse her of such nonsense? Soper and Hubler were both thrown out. On February 23rd, the daughter of Mallon's former employer died of typhoid. Worried that another outbreak was imminent if he didn't move soon, Soper presented his research to Dr. Herman Biggs, the medical officer of the New York City Department of Health. He knew the Department of Health had the authority to force Mallon to give the samples he needed to prove she was a healthy carrier. Dr. Biggs took Soper seriously and tasked the head of the department's medical inspectors, Walter Benzel, with retrieving the samples. Benzel, in turn, assigned the task to Dr. S. Josephine Baker, hoping that Mallon would be less confrontational with another woman. On March 18, 1907, Dr. Baker went to the Park Avenue house to see Mallon, and on first impression, she said that Mallon seemed like a clean, neat, self-respecting woman. Baker, who usually worked in the tenements in the slums of the city, tending to sick immigrants and their children, tried to explain why the samples were necessary. Mallon, however, still refused to give them, saying again that she was healthy. Determined, Baker went back the next day with a police escort. Benzel had said that if Mallon resisted again, she was to be taken to Willard Parker Hospital, by force if necessary. Baker blocked off the street on either side of the house in case Mallon tried to run, and had the police surround the house before she went inside to speak to Mallon again. As soon as Mallon saw Baker, it's said she thrust a carving fork at her and ran deeper into the house. Baker and the police pursued, but lost her, as she knew the house and they did not. The police asked the other servants if they had seen Mallon, but none of them said they had. It's very likely they were protecting one of their own. Around the back of the house, Baker soon noticed footprints in the snow that led over to the fence. Mallon had fled. Dr. Baker and the police officers searched the neighbor's house too, and after around 5 hours, spotted a piece of blue cloth sticking out from under the door of an outdoor closet. Mallon was dragged, kicking and swearing, from her hiding place and forced into a waiting ambulance. Dr. Baker herself sat on Mallon all the way to the hospital to keep her from thrashing at the police officers. Mary Mallon wasn't stupid. She was a smart woman who had worked hard to get where she was. She had built her reputation as a cook from the ground up, and now worked in the homes of the most affluent families in New York City. They brought her with them to their summer homes, and not one had a bad word to say about her food. She was also one of the rising group of women that were able to independently support themselves through work. She was doing well for herself, and the accusation that she was unclean and infected with typhoid must have sounded ridiculous to her. At the hospital, Mallon was tested for typhoid bacteria, and her feces was found to be teeming with it. She was indeed the first identified healthy carrier of typhoid in North America. Soper had been right. Mallon was confined to the hospital to prevent her from spreading typhoid while they tried to figure out how to treat her. The doctors began throwing around phrases like human culture tube and living fever factory. They tried to convince Mallon to have her gallbladder removed, as there was a chance that would quell her infection. Mallon refused, knowing surgery was risky and disbelieving of the doctors who had basically kidnapped her. Again and again she insisted she was healthy. How could a healthy person make people sick? Willard Parker Hospital, where she was held, was operated by the Department of Health and usually reserved for people with very contagious and fatal diseases, so it was designed for isolating patients. Mallon was trapped in a prison with sterile white walls. Day after day, Mallon gave samples of her feces to doctors, and day after day, they stood around her room discussing her case as if she weren't there. It's unknown if anyone tried to explain to her in a way she understood what was going on inside her body. Even if someone had tried, the condition wasn't well understood even by doctors, and still isn't today. 2 weeks after she was taken into custody, Mallon's story was picked up by the newspapers. Benzel was quoted as calling Mallon a menace to public health, which gave the Department of Health the authority to detain her. Soper went to visit Mallon and is reported to have told her to stop lying and admit that she knew she had spread typhoid. He also told her he wanted to write a book about her and asked her all kinds of questions about her medical past. It's said that Mallon gave no reply, but locked herself in the toilet to avoid him. After weeks and weeks of Mallon's samples testing positive for typhoid bacteria, the Willard Parker Hospital was unsure how to proceed. Mallon was still infectious, but they were a busy hospital and her room was needed for other patients. The Department of Health decided to move Mallon to Riverside Quarantine Hospital on North Brother Island, a small island in the middle of the East River. At the time, it was being used as a tuberculosis sanitarium, but Mallon would be housed in her own separate cottage instead of on the ward. There were no bars at Riverside Hospital, but Mallon was still a prisoner. Once a week, she provided samples of her feces to the laboratory on the island, and every week they were found to contain typhoid bacteria. The doctors told Mallon they were trying to find a way to cure her and gave her medications to try and fight the bacteria. The medications, however, were ineffective and had very uncomfortable side effects. The doctors tried changing her diet, medications for other infections, and often encouraged her to have her gallbladder removed, but Mallon again refused, saying no knife would touch her skin. To Mallon, the doctors didn't seem to know what they were doing. She didn't trust them and continued to insist she was healthy. A year after her first days on the island, Mallon was allowed to have a dog, and Brehoff was allowed to visit her, but she was still quarantined by the Department of Health. Her imprisonment had raised new questions for the New York City Department of Health and for health departments everywhere. What should be done with healthy carriers? By this point, European scientists had estimated that 5% of people who recover from typhoid carry it for life, and that 3 times as many women became healthy carriers. They couldn't quarantine them all. That was impossible, not to mention unethical. How could they let them go on with their lives while also stopping them from spreading typhoid? A new health commissioner was elected to the New York Department of Health in 1908, Thomas Darlington, and the typhoid rates at the time of his election were at an all-time low. Mallon hoped he would see reason and let her go free, but Darlington didn't want to release a known carrier back into New York when it seemed as if the city was finally winning the battle against the disease. Mallon was not satisfied with that answer. She decided to prove her Department of Health doctors wrong. She had Brehoff sneak samples of her feces off the island to be tested at a private laboratory in Manhattan. When the results came back, Mallon had the proof she wanted. None of her samples showed any trace of typhoid bacteria. It's unknown if there was any sort of sabotage surrounding these tests, but Mary now had a piece of paper signed by scientists as evidence that she was healthy. The head of the laboratory at Riverside Hospital, Dr. Park, however, still refused to let her go. The samples he had continuously collected from her for over a year were sometimes clear, but the typhoid bacteria always came back. He wrote an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association stating that Mallon was still infectious, and it was in this article that he nicknamed her Typhoid Mary. It wasn't until 1909 that Mary Mallon found someone to legally represent her in a suit against the New York City Department of Health. George Francis O'Neill, an Irish immigrant and attorney, took her case. It's still not known how she got in contact with O'Neill or how she paid him. It's rumored, however, that William Randolph Hearst, a powerful newspaper publisher, set up the whole thing in return for an exclusive about Mallon's situation. Either way, on June 20th, 1909, the New York American published Mallon's name and the details of her capture and captivity. The article made her out to be a killer, but also showed sympathy, as it wasn't her fault that she was contagious. The article also pointed out that no court had ever heard her case. On the 28th of June, O'Neill filed a writ of habeas corpus, ordering Riverside Hospital to produce Mallon and explain why she was being held. The hospital complied, and when Mallon arrived at court in Manhattan, the streets were full of reporters. She told them she was neglected at the hospital and that she had never had typhoid in her life. However, during the case, the lawyers from the Department of Health explained the situation and reiterated that it had the right to hold anyone who was a threat to public health. They presented her most recent lab results, which were positive for typhoid bacteria, proving that Mallon was still a threat, even with the results from the other lab. The judge ruled on the side of the Department of Health, although he did express sympathy for Mallon. Mallon was furious, but had no recourse. She returned to her cottage on North Brother Island. Knowing it couldn't detain every healthy carrier it came across, and having no luck in actually curing Mallon, the Department of Health began to wonder if holding her was the right course of action. In January of 1910, a new health commissioner was elected, Dr. Ernst Lederle. He accepted that to keep Mallon on the island indefinitely looked bad for the department, and also that it was futile to assume that they could do the same to every healthy carrier they found. The department offered Mallon a deal. She would be released, but only if she promised to find other work than food service. Mallon agreed, and in February of 1910, she was finally released. This would be an excellent happy ending, were it the end of Mallon's story. She had trouble finding work, now that her face and name were infamously associated with typhoid, thanks to the press. She attempted to sue the Department of Health for illegally confining her and demanded $50,000 in damages, around $1.2 million in today's U.S. currency, but lost as the Department of Health reminded her they did indeed have authority to detain her. She kept to the conditions of her release for a while, checking in with the Department of Health and giving samples every few months, but when she stopped reporting in, they lost track of her. No one knew where Mallon was. In 1915, there was an outbreak of typhoid at a maternity hospital in the city, and 2 of the staff died. The Department of Health sent one of its sanitation investigators to locate the source of the outbreak, taking blood samples from all the staff. It was found that the cook, a Mrs. Brown, had tested positive, but she had quit shortly after being tested. After tracking her down, it was discovered that the cook was none other than Mary Mallon. The investigators found where she lived and searched the house, discovering Mallon hiding in the bathroom. This time, there was no struggle. Mallon went with the Department of Health investigators quietly. On March 30th, 1915, the New York Department of Health approved the indefinite detention of Mary Mallon on North Brother Island. This was in effect a life sentence. Both Dr. Josephine Baker and George Soper agreed that Mallon could not be trusted and had knowingly put lives in danger by resuming work as a cook. She was no longer an innocent victim of her condition. The public's sympathy for Mallon seemed to evaporate overnight. She was seen as a murderer now, with 3 deaths attributed to her. She was labeled as a despicable menace and an unclean witch. Mallon accepted her fate, but was still furious for a time after her recapture, insisting still that she was healthy. But eventually, she settled into a life of isolation, getting another dog to keep her company. Eventually, she was given a paying job in the laboratory of the hospital, preparing slides, and was allowed a few day trips off the island. She never tried to disappear again. In December of 1932, Mary Mallon had a stroke and became paralyzed. For the next 6 years, she was bound to a wheelchair or bedridden. Her health deteriorated, and on November 11, 1938, Mallon died of pneumonia. She had spent 26 years of her life confined to Riverside Hospital. There are many conflicting opinions about Mallon's story. She is both pitied and demonized. Did the Department of Health act harshly or correctly for the greater good of the city of New York? Why did Mallon go back to cooking when she had been told she could infect others with typhoid this way? Why did she refuse to believe what the doctors told her? Why did the health department take such strong steps with Mallon, but not with any other healthy carriers? The New York City Department of Health identified and tracked down many other healthy carriers, but none of them were treated the way Mallon had been. None of them ended up detained for life. Mallon was the unfortunate first, the one who made the department create a better system, the one who served as the example. Other carriers were banned from work in food service, caregiving, and medicine, but were paid a small stipend to help them until they found work. They were tested until they were clear of bacteria, and then left alone. In 1908, the list of healthy carriers had only 5 names, one being Mary Mallon. By 1915, there were 23, and by 1918, there were 70. By 1919, thanks to sanitation and pasteurization, most cases of typhoid were due to contact with someone who had it, or with a healthy carrier. By 1938, the list had grown to over 400 names, but Mallon was still the only one who had been detained for life. Today, death from typhoid is rare in developed countries, thanks to vaccines, but it can still be an issue in the developing world. It's treated with antibiotics, but is fast becoming resistant to them due to overuse. Outbreaks do occasionally occur in developed countries and are usually due to contaminated food that has been imported from an area that still struggles with the disease. We still don't know the mechanism behind the healthy carrier state. Research is slow going because the virus only affects humans, making animal testing impossible, and human testing an ethics minefield. Therefore, recent research has focused on the DNA of the bacteria. Using mice and a bacterium similar to typhoid, scientists noted that the bacteria was able to remain active within the immune cells, changing their inflammatory response, so instead of attacking the bacteria, the immune cells replicate non-reactive versions of themselves, which won't attack the bacteria. This is interesting, and the mechanism could be the same in humans. Further testing and human volunteers are needed to know more. If you'd like to know more about Mary Mallon, there's an excellent book by Judith Walser-Levitt titled Typhoid Mary, Captive to the Public's Health, which is very well researched and detailed, but spends a lot of time in the public health aspect. There was an excellent program on Nova based on Levitt's book called The Most Dangerous Woman in America, which you can find on YouTube. The transcript of the documentary is also available on the PBS website. Another great book is Fatal Fever by Gail Jarrow. This book is shorter, but packs a lot of detailed, well-researched information and comes with a full bibliography, chronology, and images from the time. Mary Mallon posed a dilemma for health departments everywhere. How can they protect the health of the public while also preserving the liberties of the infected person? This is still an issue today. Medicine and civil rights are not simple, and there are no easy answers, which is why science, research, and human decency are so important, and why people like Typhoid Mary Mallon, who reveal the issues in all three, spark our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media, and please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like JMat, Ramonku, Leontina, KW355, Dodge173, Sleeper Bloke Man, Rachel Stubbert's Art, Alex, MCP Fan, Liz, Juzza T, and Kaz Wu, Veronica, Chris W, Alice, Brett, Katie, Carl, Brad, Maggie J, Caitlin, and Roger have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like some MCP merchandise, an enamel pin was created for the MCP by Rad Girl Creations. If you'd like a pin, go to bit.ly/morbidpin to get yours before we run out. That's bit.ly/morbidpin. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, our mailing address is P.O. Box 176, Mentone, Melbourne, Victoria 3194. This address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. On this list are items that will help us improve the podcast, improve our workspace, and some things that are just for fun. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.
Hey, I'm Jake Barton, host of the Historium podcast. Did you ever fall asleep in history class? If so, you are definitely not alone. History can be boring when focusing on only dates and statistics. Historium, on the other hand, seeks out historical narratives in some of the most unlikely of places. Whether it's Julius Caesar being captured by pirates, or Australia losing a war to flightless birds, or radical religious communists taking over a city during the Reformation, or a Russian submariner who saved the world from nuclear annihilation, I bet you haven't heard these stories before. If you're a fan of this podcast, then I'm sure Historium would be right up your alley. You can find Historium wherever you listen to podcasts.